The Bloodborne DLC, The Old Hunters, is fine. For now. It's not the best example of a super high quality DLC expansion pack, but as far as sating demand for more Bloodborne content right now, it gets the job done. But when it comes time to replay the whole game again in the future, I might be tempted to skip this section. And far too many DLC expansions are just fine, but not great. If a level pack isn't at least acceptable, then it usually comes out feeling somewhat half-assed. Rarely does a DLC expansion truly impress as something groundbreaking and amazing. One of the uncommon examples, which is unfortunate for Bloodborne, is Dark Souls' Artorias of the Abyss, where the pack of levels ended up being more enjoyable than what was in the vanilla game. It experimented with lighting in ways the main game didn't, it featured bosses with unique challenges and fighting styles, it had vistas and level layouts that arguably looked better than the main game, all while concisely wrapping it under the tragic little backstory of one of the most appealing characters from the main game. And unlike the main game, it was pretty talkative about its story too. Artorias feels absolutely essential to the experience of Dark Souls 1, but The Old Hunters, in comparison, feels like an episodic recap of Bloodborne's most vanilla moments. There's not much coherency to the story linking its levels together. The very name of this place, The Hunter's Nightmare, already alludes to what a surreal and disjointed experience it's gonna be. The main game of Bloodborne slowly paces its way from campy Bram Stoker Halloween-y monsters on the way to grand Lovecraftian encounters of the third kind. But the DLC, on the other hand, seems like it got stuck in a place on the timeline before all those grand reveals, failing to follow up on Bloodborne's best moments, instead relishing in its earlier set pieces, flat out repeating some of the older boss concepts and also recalling level designs from Dark Souls 1. It's too safe, it's too familiar, and for a DLC expansion, that's the line that really separates the good from the great. Does the expansion truly expand the boundaries the original game set? Does it maintain the previous level of quality, or does it actually improve on it? DLC didn't have to be a dirty word. Or actually a dirty acronym, I guess. But because of the abundance of worst-case scenarios, DLC has now become synonymous with the most exploitive pricing practices in the business, nickel and diming customers for big games by piecemeal. You have the Battlefields and the Battlefronts releasing with light content that don't feel complete without the purchase of 5 or 6 extra bundles. In years past, you had the Halo and Call of Duty map packs that effectively turned off the multiplayer modes you actually bought those games for unless you forked over an extra $5 charge. Then there's Capcom's easy compatibility excuse of putting the downloadable content on the disc you buy. The only actual downloadable content in that case being a tiny bit of code and whatever they want to charge you to access what's on the disc you bought. This stuff is specifically geared to exploit early adopters. Don't pretend that these charges exist for any other reason than to take advantage of the hyper-consumers early in the game's lifetime who are most easily separated from their money. When writing a response to controversy over releasing the Chaos Warriors faction as a pre-order bonus for Total War Warhammer, a Creative Assembly developer explained that the spike in pre-order sales from locking that content off for pre-orders was precisely allocated to fund the development of that content. In their own words, they say it shouldn't be considered cut content sold as DLC because it's developed in parallel. We hired a whole extra team to do this because in total it's almost as much work as the original game. If we were to add this extra content to the main game, we'd be operating at a loss. And really, that quote actually reveals the secret that consumers can do if they want to solve this problem, which is just to wait and not buy this stuff. At its best, even the most exploitive throwaway little pieces of DLC can be easily ignored, or even better, taken advantage of, since this stuff almost always releases much cheaper and all bundled together a year later. How much do you want to bet that Creative Assembly won't release these Chaos Warriors for some absurdly low price down the road, just as they previously released the Crew Expendable pre-order DLC for Alien Isolation? At its worst, exploitive DLC neuters the entire game's content at launch, chopping off necessary endings and features to keep scores low and anger high, well after a bunch of big bundles try to rectify the mess. I loved Mass Effect 2, but still haven't even started Mass Effect 3, and that came out like, 3 years ago? Even though I'm sure I'd enjoy it more than people did at launch, it's way cheaper now and so is all the Apology DLC. But as it stands now, downloadable content doesn't even mean downloadable content. It's industry jargon loaded with silent signifiers that actually amount to a small and paid-for piece of downloadable content. When Witcher 3 and Splatoon were announcing earlier this year that they were releasing free DLC in the weeks following launch, I found myself constantly rereading a lot of sentences in articles and press releases just to understand what free DLC as a term means. 10 years ago, what is now called free DLC would have just been called a content update, with no reason to go for a charismatic marketing strategy by bragging about how free it is. The downloadable content that DLC stands for doesn't even imply a purchase anyway. Shouldn't paid DLC be the exception rather than the norm? That's not the case, and the silently agreed definition of what DLC is so rigidly set in stone by now that the bigger ones, Bloodborne's The Old Hunters and Witcher's Hearts of Stone, specifically market themselves with the word expansions rather than DLC. It's a nostalgic callback to an ideal best-case scenario in which DLC resembles the boxed PC expansion packs of old. But even then, you gotta remember that downloadable games are a good decade old at this point, and there's enough of a historical pool to fairly compare the relative quality of the very best boxed expansions against the very best downloadable ones. And there's still no clear winner there, either. Nostalgia always picks the winners, because for every Half-Life opposing force, there was at least one Half-Life Blue Shift. Blood Moon and Tribunal were great, but not any more so than Shivering Isles or every single one of the New Vegas DLCs. Plus, the financial burdens of putting an expansion pack inside a box and shipping it out to retailers for customers who would inevitably get confused over whether or not they were buying the right thing for their kids meant that there was less room for experimentation with them. While most of them kind of floundered, the ones that aimed big had to hit real big. Expansion packs for real-time strategy games had a massive advantage. Stuff like Brood War for StarCraft, Yuri's Revenge for Red Alert 2, and The Conquerors for Age of Empires 2 coexisted with an awful lot of FPS level packs that were pretty bad more often than they were not. And they gradually became forgotten, and in some cases potentially illegal. But one of the reasons why mediocrity is such a recurring theme in the world of expansions is that developers often use them to test out new teams and give them some experience before tackling bigger projects. Like how Valve contracted a young Gearbox Software, who would later go on to make the Brothers in Arms and Borderlands franchises, to do the Half-Life expansions as their very first projects. Or more recently, the Minerva's Den DLC for BioShock 2, which was handed off to a new team of level designers who happened to be big Looking Glass fans who later started the Fulbright Company. But in the case of the Souls games, that excellent Artorias of the Abyss expansion was made by much of the same team behind the vanilla game. Same deal with the Missing Link for Deus Ex and the 2 DLC chapters for GTA 4, both of which have almost exactly the same credit sequences as the original, with most of the differences in staff happening for the Ballad of Gay Tony. And all of these examples are generally well regarded as some of the best examples of DLC. Lengthy, substantial, and unique expansions where the developers applied everything they learned making the main game while also responding to the feedback and reception it received. Because if you give the same team enough time and resources to make more of the same, that's what's bound to happen. Right now, I can't readily find a credits roll for the team that put together the Old Hunters for Bloodborne. I'll be real interested in seeing just how much of the original staff was behind it, since they're also juggling Dark Souls 3 at the same time, and FromSoft is suspected to be alternating teams in and out for consecutive sequels. Until then, I'm satisfied with it, and I also have the Witcher's expansions to look forward to, which means that between the two of them, this is the first time since the days of New Vegas that I've been looking forward to playing some actually good DLC for once.